I'm Cecilia, and if you've ever been underestimated because you stayed quiet, kept working, and didn't fight for attention, this story is for you. 6 days after we buried my parents, my sister changed the locks on the house. I stood on the front porch of the only home I had ever known, key in hand, and realized it no longer fit the door. My sister Brenda, who had been gone for 2 decades and hadn't spent more than a holiday phone call on that farm in years, stood on the other side of the screen door holding my mother's coffee mug like she belonged there. She told me the house was hers now. So was the land. So was the money. All of it, she said, nearly $28 million worth, and she wanted me out by morning. What Brenda didn't know was that my parents had seen this coming long before either of us did. And when the lawyer opened the second envelope, everything she thought she had won disappeared in front of her. My family's farm sits on 250 acres in Western Virginia. Apple trees on one side, cattle pasture on the other, a creek cutting through the back acreage, and mountains in the distance. My grandfather started it with almost nothing. My father spent his whole adult life turning it into a serious operation. He added storage buildings, equipment, supplier contracts, and enough infrastructure to keep 11 people working during harvest season. My mother managed the books until arthritis made it too painful to write for long stretches. After that, she taught me. I went away to college, got my accounting degree, and came back home at 23. I never left again. For 10 years, I handled the farm finances. Every payroll run, every equipment payment, every feed invoice, every insurance premium, every shipment to the co-op. I knew that place from the inside out, not just the land, but the systems that kept it alive. If something went wrong, I was usually the one who noticed first. Brenda was 5 years older than me, and she left the moment she legally could. On her 18th birthday, she threw a duffel bag into the back of some boyfriend's truck and announced she wasn't going to waste her life on a farm. She said it right in front of our mother. Then she left. After that, her life became one long series of unfinished chapters. Fashion school that didn't last, marriages that didn't last, jobs that came and went, cities, apartments, excuses. She rarely came home, but she did stay in contact when she needed money, $500, $2,000, a car repair, a deposit, a bad month. My parents always sent something. Once I asked my father why. He said, because no matter what she does, she's still my daughter. Then came the phone call. It was a Tuesday in November. I was finishing monthly reports when the kitchen landline rang. Nobody ever used that phone anymore, so I almost let it go to voicemail. It was the state police. My parents had been driving back from the county farmers market when a deer jumped into the road. My father swerved. The truck hit the rail and rolled. Dad died at the scene. Mom lived a few more hours at the hospital, but she never woke up. I called Brenda from the parking lot in the middle of the night. When she answered, the first thing out of her mouth wasn't, "What happened?" It wasn't, "Are they okay?" It was there life insurance? That told me everything I needed to know about how the next week was going to go. I handled the funeral arrangements myself. The obituary, the church, the flowers, the endless calls to people who needed to be told. I called the co-op, the suppliers, the attorney. I made sure the cattle were fed and the order still moved. Grief didn't stop the farm, and neither could I. Brenda said she was coming right away. She arrived 3 days later in a rental car with her first ex-husband, Derek, the car salesman. The moment they pulled into the driveway, I could tell they weren't there to mourn. Brenda looked at the house the way someone looks at a property they're about to flip. Derek walked the edge of the yard with his phone out, glancing at corners, fence lines, and road frontage like he was already calculating value. An hour later, Brenda was opening file drawers in my father's office and asking where the deed, the bank information, and the will were kept. I told her the attorney had the important documents and that the will would be handled officially. She barely listened. She said she had already spoken to a lawyer in Richmond who told her that, as the eldest surviving child, she was entitled to everything. That was the beginning. The funeral was packed. My parents had deep roots in that county. Dad coached Little League. Mom organized church drives and fundraiser suppers. People came from all over. I gave the eulogy. Brenda sat in the front row, silent, checking her phone when she thought nobody was watching. After the service, my mother's best friend, Ruth Ann, took both my hands and said, "Your mama made sure things were handled." At the time, I thought she meant emotionally, spiritually, the kind of thing people say after a burial. I didn't realize she meant legally. The morning after the funeral, Brenda called me into the living room like she was summoning an employee. Derek stood behind her while she laid out printouts from county property records, inheritance websites, and some summary from a Richmond attorney who had clearly only heard her version of the story. Then she said something I'll never forget. She looked me dead in the face and said, "You were never really family, Cecilia. You were the hired help. Not the daughter who stayed, not the one who worked beside our parents for 10 years, not the one who sat at our mother's hospital bed while she died. The hired help." I told her we could settle all of it when the lawyer read the will. She didn't care. She had already decided reality would cooperate with her. By the next morning, the front locks had been changed. I stood on the porch with my key that no longer worked, and Brenda opened the door wearing my mother's robe, holding my mother's mug, and acting like I was some confused guest who didn't know checkout time had passed. So I packed, not out of surrender, out of patience. I took my clothes, my laptop, the farm records, a USB drive with 10 years of bookkeeping, and the framed picture from my nightstand. Then I moved across the yard into the small barn apartment my parents had once used for seasonal workers. It was cramped, dusty, and cold, but it had a roof, a lock, and enough room for my files. That same night, I heard Brenda through the kitchen window telling Derek to call a realtor. She wanted the place listed by Friday. The next morning, I called our attorney, Tom Beckett. He told me the official reading would be Tuesday and that everyone needed to be present. Then he added something strange. "Bring your records," he said. That got my attention. Over the next few days, Brenda got bolder. She tried to cancel our Apple contract with the co-op. She told 2 longtime seasonal workers they were being let go. Derek started calling agents and casually discussing what the property might bring on the market. Word spread fast through town. Brenda was telling people I had manipulated our parents, isolated them, and tried to steal her inheritance. Then something happened that made the whole thing even uglier. Pastor Greer came to see me in the barn apartment. This was a man who had known my family for years. He had eaten at our table, prayed with my parents, and buried them only days earlier. But he didn't come to comfort me. He came to pressure me. He told me Brenda was the older daughter, that maybe peace in the family meant stepping aside, that perhaps it was time to let her take the lead. Then he mentioned that Brenda had spoken about making a large donation to the church once the estate was settled. That was when I understood. He wasn't defending justice. He was protecting a promise. I let him talk. Then I told him the will would be read on Tuesday and the truth would sort itself out. By Monday, rumors were everywhere. Someone even told me Brenda had already signed papers with a developer from Charlottesville. That afternoon, I checked the mailbox and found an envelope from Blue Ridge Development. Inside was a formal letter of intent to purchase the farm for $22 million. It was signed by Brenda, signed by a woman who did not legally own a fence post. I called Tom immediately. He told me to keep the letter and said something I would hear more than once that week. "Tuesday will clear things up." That night, Derek came into the barn apartment and offered me $50,000 if I would sign away any claim I had. $50,000. He said I had no leverage, no standing, and no chance of fighting them. He told me I was living in a barn and ought to be realistic. I told him I'd let the will decide. He didn't like that answer. After he left, I couldn't sleep. I started straightening the room just to keep my hands busy. When I pulled the cot away from the wall, I found a dusty box. Inside was an envelope with my mother's handwriting on it. It said, "Cecilia, when you need this." Inside was a short note. She wrote that if I was reading it, things had probably gone the way she and my father feared. She said Brenda would try to take everything and that I shouldn't waste time arguing. She told me to trust Tom, trust the paperwork, trust what I had built. I sat on that floor for a long time holding that note. My mother had known. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to leave me a map for the moment I would need it. Tuesday morning, I got up before sunrise and did the chores like I always did. Fed the cattle, checked the water, looked over the storage unit. Then I showered, dressed in clean work clothes, packed my binders, and drove to Tom Beckett's office. When I got there, Ruth Ann was already in the conference room. So was Margot from the co-op. That surprised me. Brenda and Derek arrived next, dressed like people headed into a victory press conference. Pastor Greer came last and took a seat near the door. Tom stood at the head of the table with a thick set of documents. Then he said something that changed the atmosphere instantly. This estate plan has two parts. Brenda looked confused, but not worried yet. Tom started with part one of the will. He read the bequest to Brenda first. The family home, all its contents, and $280,000 from a savings account. Brenda looked satisfied for about 3 seconds. Then Tom read the condition. She could keep the house only if she lived in it and maintained it for 5 full years. If she failed to do that, the house would return to the Everett Family Trust. Her face changed immediately. She said she had no intention of living there for 5 years. Derek asked where the rest of the estate was. Tom said, "That is addressed in part 2. That's when he opened the second envelope. Inside was the document nobody expected. 7 years earlier, while both my parents were alive and in sound health, they had established an irrevocable trust. The trust contained the real wealth, the 250 acres of farmland, every structure and piece of equipment, mineral rights, cooperative equity, and an educational fund. Total estimated value, approximately $27.5 million. Brenda went pale. She had spent the week acting like she'd inherited a fortune, and technically she had been handed a house with strings attached and a bank account smaller than she expected. The real estate, the operating assets, the future of the farm, all of it had been legally moved years before my parents died. Then Tom read the requirements for the trustee. The person in charge of the trust had to have lived on the farm continuously for at least 5 years before my parents' deaths, maintained verifiable farm financial records, and participated actively in the local agricultural community. Brenda met none of those conditions. She hadn't lived there in 20 years. She didn't know the books. She barely knew the people. Then Tom read the name. The designated trustee of the Everett Family Irrevocable Trust is Cecilia Marie Everett. I didn't move. I don't think I even breathed for a second. My parents had not left me a prize. They had left me stewardship, responsibility, work, a future they believed I could protect. Tom continued. The trust required the trustee to keep the farm operating, support the community, and manage an educational fund for rural students. If I failed, the trust wouldn't go to Brenda. It wouldn't go to any individual at all. It would pass to a community development foundation. My parents had sealed every exit. Brenda called it a setup. Derek threatened a contest. Tom calmly explained that irrevocable trusts created by competent adults, witnessed properly and notarized years in advance, were not easy to break. Then Ruth Ann and Margot were identified as the witnesses. They had both been there when my parents signed it. That shut down a lot of Brenda's noise. Still, Tom wasn't finished. There was one last attachment, a personal letter from my parents to both daughters to be read aloud. It was the hardest part. They said they loved us equally. They said they had given Brenda freedom again and again throughout her adult life. Apartments, cars, second chances, money for fresh starts. They said they had given me roots, the farm, the work, the community, because I had chosen that life every day. Then came the line that broke the room open. They wrote that the trust was not a reward for me. It was a responsibility, and they trusted me with it because I had already been carrying that responsibility for years without asking for recognition. They told Brenda the house wasn't meant as a consolation prize. It was an invitation to come home and learn what had been built there. If she stayed, she might finally understand why I never left. If she didn't, the house would go back into trust and be used for the good of the town. At that point, Ruth Ann was crying. Margot was staring at the table with red eyes. Even Derek had gone quiet because there was nothing to sell, spin, or negotiate anymore. Brenda snapped. She said it wasn't fair, said I had turned our parents against her, said I had stolen everything. That was when I stood up and finally answered her. The hired help kept the books, I said, and the books don't lie. She had no answer for that. Tom informed her that if she wanted to contest the trust, she could try, but the legal costs would be enormous and the chances of success were tiny. She and Derek left in a storm of anger and blame, turning on each other before they even made it out the door. At one point, Derek admitted they had already lined up a buyer and planned to turn the land into a subdivision. Tom noted very calmly that trying to sell property without legal authority could be considered fraud. That ended whatever swagger Derek had left. After they were gone, Pastor Greer apologized. I believed he was ashamed, but shame doesn't erase choices. He had chosen fear over truth and money over loyalty. I accepted his apology without pretending it fixed anything. Ruth Ann hugged me and told me my mother had known exactly who I was. Margot shook my hand and said the co-op contracts were safe. Tom told me my parents had been smart, deliberate, and absolutely certain. When I drove back to the farm, Brenda's rental car was gone. I stood in the yard between the house and the barn and finally understood what my parents had done. They hadn't chosen one daughter over the other because of affection. They had chosen the future over entitlement. They had protected the land from being sold off by someone who only saw acreage and dollar signs. 3 months later, the dust had mostly settled. Brenda lasted less than 2 weeks in the house. Once the reality of rural life set in, maintenance, heating oil, septic problems, roof leaks, silence, responsibility, she gave up and went back to Richmond. She never fulfilled the residency condition, so the process of reverting the house to the trust began. Derek ended up needing a real lawyer after all. Pastor Greer stepped away from church leadership. A new pastor took over. Life went on, and one of the best parts of the whole thing happened in February, when the Everett Educational Fund issued its first scholarships to rural students studying agriculture and community development. I signed those checks at my mother's kitchen table. I moved back into the house after Brenda left. I changed the lock one final time. My key fit. Brenda did call me once after that. No apology, no reflection, no grief. She asked if there was any way for her to get more money out of the trust. I told her the trust wasn't there for us to raid. It was there to preserve the farm and help the community. She asked if I was really just going to sit on $27 million. I told her I wasn't sitting on it. I was managing it. For a moment, she sounded almost like the older sister I remembered from childhood. Then she said it wasn't fair and hung up. Maybe in her version of the story, it never will be. But from where I stand, fairness isn't about birth order. It isn't about who came first. It's about who stayed when staying was hard, who showed up when there was work to do, who carried the weight when nobody was watching. My parents didn't leave me a fortune. They left me proof that quiet loyalty matters, proof that patience outlasts performance, proof that the one everyone mistakes for background support is sometimes the only person holding the whole thing together. So yes, my sister changed the locks, but my parents had already built the door she could never get through. That's my story. If you've ever been the one who stayed while everyone else ran toward easier lives and louder dreams, don't doubt what that means. One day, the truth catches up, and when it does, it won't need to shout.